Hello?
When I think about horror in the past few years, a few notable moments come to mind, and there seems to be a common theme when it comes to their presentation. And I think this is because I'm tired of knowing how movies are going to try and scare me, and so when I find something unpredictable, it's refreshing. And so today I wanted to talk to you about why intimacy in horror is worth your time.
Baby, I got the power.
Intimacy has its roots buried in romance, and so it's tricky in horror. It can be tough to strike a balance between not watering down the scares and not foregoing the effect intimacy has, and so I was curious to see if anybody had had similar thoughts to mine. Spoiler alert, not really, but I did find a few uses of the words together. It's one specific article, however, which I think is most useful to me, that being horror is not defined by what scares you by Vulture, which I think sums up my thoughts pretty well in its opening line. Since the early days of film, horror's greatest strength has been its intimacy. To elaborate, horror and fear seem intimate because what scares you is what scares you. You may have a problem with hands, eyes, or tongues, and therefore you're susceptible to certain kinds of scenes. However, I think intimacy has a broader appeal. Like, yes, most people have hands, eyes, and a tongue, but the scenarios and situations in which intimacy is involved with tend to be more familiar. And that's not to say intimacy is always suitable. Not all horror will work well with intimacy. It doesn't need to. It does have a specific effect, typically found in these types of horror movies. However, the use of intimacy outside this type of movie is severely limited. This should change. I feel like there are two main ways in which intimacy is incorporated into horror, either thematically or through presentation. Thematically, it's introduced when exploring physical intimacy, and there are some prime examples of this, including the 2014 film It Follows. A film which manages to add legitimate, tangible danger to physicality. It introduces weight and consequence to being intimate, something which is missing from plenty of media. The consequences are what is focused on, but being a horror film and all, what those consequences are is entirely up to the film. And in this case, as opposed to children, you get the arguably better option of being murdered. Speaking of the French, the 2016 French horror movie Raw is similarly inventive, although instead adolescent cannibalism takes centre stage. Cannibalistic tendencies aren't a new idea to horror, but treating it with such realism makes it feel more upsetting. Hearing Hannibal Lecter talk about eating someone's liver is entertaining. Watching someone eat raw chicken out of the fridge like a hungry raccoon is a little more uncomfortable. Still entertaining though. Just to balance things out, I feel like I need to mention Teeth, a 2007 American horror film with a peculiarly shaped bite. Why is it so peculiar, you're probably not asking. Well, it's because it uses the surreptitious kind of body horror that once again adds immediate physical consequence to intimacy. However, unlike our previous two examples, there's a complete lack of choice involved regarding how our main character is afflicted. The horror is a native part to the character, which allows the film to develop a different type of dynamic. For a movie with such an aggressively taboo subject, it has an unusually strong focus on building and portraying trust. Pretty surprising for a movie about a girl with a area, part number 2, this is the second part. I want to talk about slow, quiet scenes, some of my favourites. There is something special about individual scenes that make purposeful use of pacing and sound. They are refreshing and some of the most memorable. It's unfortunate how much lazy horror has ruined quiet, which itself is heavily involved in the making of a good atmosphere. I don't trust silence anymore, and it's distracting in a lot of films. Not to say this is all the time. Take one of my favourite scenes from the last decade.
What canst thou give?
Wouldst thou like the taste of butter, a pretty dress? Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
Yes.
These scenes are rooted in romance and drama, and they're wonderful, but clearly that's where they feel most appropriate.
나는 이 모브 말이 그럴듯하다. 그의 붙어벚꽃이 더 탐스럽게, 더 오래 피는 것만 봐도 알만하잖아.
The tracks of those wolves and the girl with them. This place must be where the four of them live.
Now, if we compare these scenes to those of the same kind in horror, the difference really becomes evident.
What's going on? You were sleepwalking.
I am so sorry. Who are you?
It's clear a lot of thought goes into these scenes. It feels very deliberate, and I like that. I wanted to take some time to talk about the scene that inspired the train of thought that led to this video. It's from the Australian horror film The Tunnel, a relatively standard found footage movie, but its surprising spatial awareness and exceptional sound design. There's no point in this specific scene where I feel threatened by a jump scare or think a major character is about to be unceremoniously killed off. And this is because filmmakers make conscious choices on how they choose to scare us, and this is a moment that epitomizes those decisions, culminating into a scene that is legitimately scary. I had a, let's say, troublesome time getting this scene out of my head until now I've watched it so many times I no longer feel anything, and I've put this down to two major qualities: the setup of the scene and the length of the interaction. It's clear from the get-go we're not here to watch a character not die, but rarely do films spend time just to torturously kill minor characters, and as strange as it sounds, I appreciate it here. Not only does it add more suspense for subsequent scenes, but is pretty heartbreaking in its own right. Not least in part due to the culmination of the scene, which features a full 12 seconds of weirdly intimate neck breaking. 12 seconds of neck breaking is an eternity. It successfully removes the comfort in death. Isn't that terrifying? This may be unexpected, but I also highly doubt it is expected. I feel that there is a distinct intimate quality to body horror. There's very little as visceral or inherently inescapable as body horror. This has been explored in a fair few movies by the likes of John Carpenter and David Cronenberg, and although these can handle the subjects wonderfully, they lack a certain something, in my opinion. Now, I talked earlier about consequence. What I didn't say, however, is how they're used within specific media formats. The marriage of body horror and consequence comes in the form of video games. There are more than a few examples of body horror being used in horror games, but one really works the two together. This part from Dead Space 2. It could definitely be done in movie form, it practically has, but it would lack the sense of responsibility which makes the horror game so stressful. Or even take something like chase scenes, which are made infinitely more stressful when you know your actions determine the outcome. You can't distract yourself or peek through your fingers, you have to focus on the scary stuff. Even without the use of consequence and control, horror games still have the benefit of perspective. Horror games commonly put players into first person, which is much more restrictive and personal than third person. When used alongside body horror, it feels more confrontational, clearly shown off in these moments from Outlast and Resident Evil, all of which just feel especially visceral. Like this scene from Outlast, where you get your fingers cut off with some tetanus-coated toilet shears. This type of horror is so effective and fun, and I would kill for more of it. Really showcases why intimacy works so well with horror, and especially how, if there's a media perfect for horror, it's video games. They can just be more... what's the word? Yeah. That's it.